And it's a great pleasure to have Joe Perry here, who's spoken to this group, well, not this group, but he's spoken in Cambridge, come to one of our dinners before, which I can still remember what you said, because I quote it to people sometimes. I'll tell you afterwards what it was. Joe's going to talk about GM crops and GM food, and he's going to tell you something about his career and his beliefs. So all that I'll tell you is that Rothamsted, which is where he works, is apparently the oldest agricultural research station in the world, and it's where they discovered how fertilizers worked, apparently. So we should all be grateful to them, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. Yes, Dennis did ask me to say something about my background. Well, I started off studying maths, and then I did biometry, which is statistics for the life sciences. And I went to Rothamsted and I worked there for 29 years, first in the statistics department, but I did so many ecological papers, they kicked me out to the ecology division. And I've worked on GM since about 1999, and I retired 3 months ago after having taken part in the UK trials of genetically modified crops. That's a scientific background. Religious background. I'm the son of a Jewish mother. I never knew my father, he wasn't Jewish, and after 3 months I was fostered by a wonderful Christian lady who took me to church, and when I was 5.5 I was adopted by a Jewish family and taken to synagogue and had a bar mitzvah, and then there was a long period of agnosticism from my teens, and then I became a Christian. So that's where I'm coming from. And Dennis also said to me, now if you're talking this afternoon, all the speakers have to include some Richard Dawkins material, you realise. So here it is. And according to Dawkins, I'm obviously, my brain has become addled because I've converted. Various quotes here, all saying that I'm no longer intelligent. So I thought, being a pseudoscientist, we could do an experiment on this, and here is the number of my referee papers by year, and the question is, when did I convert? Because clearly there should have been a great decline in my output. So any offers, I don't know. Well, I'll put you out of your misery. So a lot of slides to get through. It was 1996, and you can see there's been a marginal, but I think statistically significant increase in the number of papers since then. Anyway, I hope that shows you I haven't actually lost my sense of fun through conversion. I'm in the Church of England. Perhaps I haven't got as strong a faith as I would like to have. And regarding creationism and interpretation of the Bible, I think I can say I believe in evolution pretty well as a fact, not a theory. In an hour, I don't think I can get through all the material I'd hoped to, and certainly I can't cover all those references I gave in the abstract, but if you look at them, at least they'll give you a lead into the subject, a very recent lead in from the last 6 months, both pro and anti. My slides are going to separate into the scientific material from the sort of religious quotes questions, and they are just questions to provoke discussion, and those have got a green background. So we learnt something about the way plant biotechnology is done this morning from John. Normally in traditional breeding we just shuffle up thousands of genes from the same species usually without having much idea of what was going to appear, whereas in GM we are after a particular outcome, usually an outcome that we know beforehand, and usually most GM crops have just got one particular gene inserted, maybe more than one, but usually one, so they have a particular trait. And here, for example, here's the plasmid that John was talking about before, and it's got an insert from a firefly gene which makes it glow when it needs a drink of water. Now this is not this is an experiment, it's not a commercially grown genetically modified crop, but if it were, then that event would just be done once, just once in the lab, and then all the breeding on from there to getting seed for commercial use is just done by conventional plant breeding. And in fact, that's one of the reasons, I think there are many others, but it's one of the reasons that Jewish people don't have a problem with whether GM crops are kosher or not, because the immediate progeny has not been modified. There's nothing much to worry about with GM crops in the sense that they're not going to suddenly leave the ground and come after your daughter with an axe or anything like that. People seem to imagine all sorts of... It's actually very difficult to tell the difference between what is a GM plant and what is not. To all intents and purposes, they look alike. They're grown pretty well all over the world, not much in Europe, and they are growing in abundance at quite a rate, between 10 and 20% per year, both in the West, particularly the West, but also now in developing countries. And I guess that could be the first of a set of questions we might ask. Well, we know they've got risks, I'm not going to deny that. Is there any point to growing them when we've got enough food anyway in the West? If they're risky, why grow them? On the other hand, are we becoming too risk averse? I mean, didn't God give us a risky world to live in? So there should be a balance in risk taking. Where should it be? Well, might GM crops be an answer for less developed countries? Well, if so, should we export a risky technology to them? And isn't it anyway the distribution of food rather than the amount of food which is important? Derek Burke says, yes, there's truth in that, but is that any reason to throw away potentially beneficial technology? Let's come back to the third world. At the moment, most of the crops are resistant to something that are grown, resistant to herbicide, to insects, or to viruses, and there are other traits which are thought about. In fact, rice now, we're in the process of adding vitamin A to rice to make golden rice, which will help lots of disease in the third world, including childhood blindness. And there are other traits that are being researched which clearly may be beneficial: drought and saline tolerant, ability to produce effectively its own fertilizer, and better storage. So some things are on the way but are not here yet. A very good lead-in to the discussion of the pros and cons is this document from the Nuffield Council for Bioethics, published in 2003 for developing countries, and the Royal Society too have done their own one on transgenic plants and world agriculture. Looking at this table, we can see, yes, a big increase, and particularly look at places like China. That's a very large increase, 11-fold, and now India. And in fact, the thing to emphasise, I think, is that we're not talking about GM crops as just the province of rich farmers. There are 6.4 million farmers in China using GM crops. So the third world is already, developing countries are benefiting, their farmers are benefiting from this technology. And what crops are we talking about? Mainly maize, but also soya, a non-food crop, cotton, and this canola is usually known as oilseed rape. Will we need GM crops in the future? Do we really need them, was the title I was given by Dennis. Well, the next few slides I think show that probably yes. We're about 6 or 7 billion at the moment. The projection is that we're going to go up quite rapidly to maybe plateau out about 10 billion, maybe no one really knows. And most of that growth is going to be in the developing regions. At the same time, obviously the amount of arable land per head is going down anyway, and we've got more population, so it's going down even further. What about our ability to use conventional agriculture. In the 60s, there was a revolution caused by the use of herbicides, which increased yields. And then in the tropics, we're used to the improved plant varieties, which were part of the Green Revolution. So we increased our worldwide yields quite a lot over that period. But since then, since the 1980s, there's been a plateauing out. And it's difficult to see any conventional way, through conventional farming, without biotechnology, that we could suddenly increase our yields again to feed the mouths that will be with us soon. So I'm now going to run through the three traits, the three commonest traits of GM crops. I said they were usually, what is grown at the moment, are usually resistant to something. And the first one is herbicide tolerance. Now, what does that mean? Under GM HT, herbicide tolerant management, you would have the crop as you would normally have, and the crop will be threatened by weeds. Different classes of weeds usually require different sorts of herbicides. So the farmer will use a different class of herbicides for broad-leaved weed or for a grass weed. But obviously, he doesn't want to use a herbicide that would kill the crop. If the farmer went down to his local garden centre and bought some Roundup off the shelf, which is glyphosate, this is a broad spectrum, not very toxic herbicide, and sprayed that on an unmodified crop, well, this kills all green plant material. That's why it's called broad spectrum, and so the lot would be killed. Under GMHT, the crop has been modified to be tolerant to a specific herbicide, in this case, glyphosate. And so when the farmer sprays that, all he gets left with is the GM crop. A potent form of weed control, possibly too potent, as we might see later. But also you are reducing the amount of different herbicides you have to put on, and there's a better flexibility. You don't always have to spray prophylactically. You can wait and see to what extent you really do need to use that herbicide under that system. So it has disadvantages and advantages. Notice that we're talking here about advantages for the farmer. No perceived advantage for the consumer. Insect resistance. Cotton and other crops can be attacked by moth larvae, pests, and if that happens, you'll get a denuding of the entire plant. That's healthy cotton there. Now, what they've done here is they've engineered a naturally occurring toxin, Bacillus thuringiensis, actually so natural it's used by organic farmers, and that's engineered into cotton plants that expresses the toxin in all their cells, so if that caterpillar eats the leaves, then the larvae die. And that's been responsible for a great reduction in insecticide application, so that's good for the environment as well as being good for the farmer. You no longer have to spray, and if you spray, of course you're spraying out all the insects, not just the harmful pests but also beneficials such as ladybirds. So this is quite a specifically targeted method. It's only Lepidoptera that are affected. There are other problems which I can maybe go into later in the discussion. Previously we would have had to rely on integrated pest management techniques, which are like working with ecology in order to reduce pesticide. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I think these new crops really have made an enormous difference in terms of the amount of insecticide that they have saved us having to put on crops. So that's another, that's a thing that's good for the environment as well as the farmer. But again, not for the consumer. And then finally we've got virus resistance. Plants get diseases as well as humans. They get virus diseases, although we usually shake off a virus. The plant often doesn't and can be killed by it. And you can see these virus-infected papaya look pretty awful and taste pretty awful. Trees have been genetically engineered to confer resistance to that ring spot virus, and so that fruit is harvestable. Again, that's a benefit for the farmer. What about the consumer? And indeed, in the late 1990s, at least in the UK, there was a very strong campaign mounted by NGOs and in the media, and consumers stopped buying the GM products that they had been buying in supermarkets. There were GM products in the supermarkets. Consumers decided they didn't like them. And one reason was that there was nothing in it for them. This is an example. Monsanto are trying to develop a crop which will have low saturated fat in the product. Appeals to health conscious Westerners. Maybe we should be going out doing a bit more running like John does rather than buying this sort of food, but anyway. What about something that we could agree maybe was more altruistic, more for the public good? Here's two things from the year 2000, a debate in Parliament, and the MP for Selly Oak is asking about genetically modified crops such as bananas that contain a cholera vaccine. Would be a nice easy way of vaccinating people. Or this golden rice that I mentioned, high levels of vitamin A engineered into the rice. Here's another one from the year 2000, actually from my diocesan newsletter, a debate at a church in Hertfordshire, and there the motion that GM represent a positive step forward for humanity was passed overwhelmingly. Probably, almost certainly, because it was posed by medical research scientists. You've heard from John this morning the advances that we can make using GM in medicine. Few consumers, I think, would be horrified by that, but many consumers are horrified. So my next question, I suppose, is why is it that GM food attracts so much opposition and the medical techniques are largely accepted? But there are other questions that it raises about progress, about our ability to move forward technologically and whether this is always a good thing, whether we have God's blessing in changing our created planet or not. So how long have we been intervening to mould modern agriculture? Some people like Colin Tudge think it's about 25,000 years actually, not just 8,000. But what guidelines do we use to justify any intervention? And I asked in my Science and Christian Belief article that I refer to in the abstract, I asked, is it of necessity that there are conflicts between GM crops and stewardship, of which we'll hear more tonight from Sir Gillian Prance, alleviation of poverty and alleviation of hunger? So some more questions there. And at this point, I'm going to, hopefully, change presentations. So I'm going on to the next one, which I'll try and take a bit slower, actually, because it's really the meat in the sandwich. So here we are. Here we go. Yes, Rodney, you're absolutely right. It's John Selwyn Gummer, who I think was been very good for the environment since he stopped being a Tory minister, and he's feeding a beef burger to his daughter. It's quite a famous event.
Speaking at our Faraday course in September.
Excellent. So you can tell him he's already been featured. So there are risks, and what are the 4 risks? Food safety, genetic effects whereby the genes flow from the GM crop to other plants. Indirect ecological effects, and there, for example, with the herbicide-tolerant crops that we studied in the UK farm trials between 2000 and 2003, what we were studying there was the effects on wildlife. And we were studying the effects of a whole management system. It wasn't the fact that they were GM, it was actually the fact that you were using a very powerful herbicide with knock-on effects on your arable ecosystem. So it wasn't the GM-ness of the crop we were studying, it was the management of that GM crop. But there is no doubt that there are these indirect effects that need study and need the risk assessing. And then what we might be even more interested in is the effects on people, effects on this lady who is saving her maize seed, the effects on poor farmers, so socio-economic and bioethical issues. And I'll try and go through all of these. But first let me come right out and say what is my view, and that is that most major technologies have got benefits and risks. Here a doctor is using a mobile phone, hopefully to help treat a patient. This man's driving a car using his mobile phone. He's not even looking at the road. Look, he's looking up at the ceiling. So clearly a risk. Rescuers use explosives to rescue miners. Here, from this week, an Israeli jet has used explosives and killed an innocent civilian. So, benefits and risks, but I would argue that's not a good reason to reject them completely. I would say it's better to assess the benefits and the risks, to weigh them in the balance, and then make a decision not on the whole technology. More questions. Is there a spiritual requirement to assess risk? As a Christian, should I be reckless or not? Probably not, I think. I'm not sure. Not being very good theologically. And if we do risk assessment, how are we actually going to do it? I've taken this from the marriage service. Lovely words, aren't they? From the old Church of England marriage service. This is how we should assess risk, I think. Not unadvisedly, lightly or wantonly, but reverently, discreetly, soberly, and in the fear of God. Other questions. What about our need for humility and the dangers of overreaching ourselves with technology? And how precautionary should we be? The precautionary principle is a great principle, but can be interpreted in many different ways. You can either have a strong precautionary principle or a weak one. You can either say, I don't know the full answer here, and so I suggest we do nothing. Or you can say, as maybe a risk assessor would say, we do need to assess the risk. We don't know all the answers. We can assign probabilities. We've got quite a lot of knowledge. Let's assess the risk and then make a decision. And questions such as, well, if we took the precautionary principle to extremes, we would never actually do anything or make any progress. Is it really God's will that we should remain living as cavemen? Maybe that's a bit of a loaded question. Sorry. Risk assessment. Now, there's already been a question given to me today about, how do we trust risk assessors and how good a job do they do? Well, the average dossier of information supplied by a company, if they want to import GM food or feed, food is for humans, feed would be for animals, a crop for animals, or actually to sow a crop, which is releasing it into the environment and growing it. Those are the three categories. All of them would require about 200 pages of evidence. Now here's a ream of paper. That's 500 pages. So imagine that times 4. It's quite a lot of pages of evidence. Doesn't actually even fit onto one CD. It's on 2 CDs. Just to give you an idea that, surprisingly, yes, risk assessors do spend days literally poring over applications. There's a lot of information there that they use. And who are they? Generally, they're academics. Generally, they are scientists, experts in their field. They're not usually paid by industry. They're usually from universities or from research institutes. I'm going to now go over each of the 4 risks, and I'll start with food safety. And I won't say much about food safety because I'm not an expert in it. It's assessed in our country by the Advisory Committee for Novel Foods and Processes. The nice thing is they're quite transparent, so you can actually go to the websites and look. They have got a sister committee called ACRE, the Advisory Committee on Releases to the Environment, which look at the genetic effects. And in Europe, the European Food Safety Authority looks at food safety and genetic effects. And I'm now on this EFSA panel. I can actually see the detail that they go into. In terms of food safety, here's the Royal Society report 2002 on GM for food use and human health. It was an update to one they did before. Bob May, Lord May of Oxford, the president of the Royal Society and ex-government chief scientific advisor, said, actually he said this as I was on my way to a public meeting to discuss the trials, so it must have been the year 2000 when we were trying to defend them in public. And I heard him on the radio, and he said, food safety is actually the least of the risks, of the many risks that there are in GM, he considered. And there are obviously many issues, but they're all discussed in that document. I won't really dwell on them, except to say I'm pretty comfortable about food safety. And indeed, we are in the middle of a 10-year experiment on North American people, because North American people have been, they've been eating this stuff for 10 years now. Those who are anti say, well, there may be long-term effects. And there's no answer to that. Obviously, you can ask someone who is a skeptic, well, right, what are you concerned about? What long-term effects are you concerned about? And at that point, they usually say, well, I'm not sure, but there might be long-term effects. So, again, it raises the question, well, how long do you have to wait before you know whether it is safe to go on? And eventually, you have to weigh the evidence and, I think, make a decision. There is another aspect of food safety, though, and I think this is quite a good article in The Independent, which tends to be against GM crops. This is against, but it is a very sensible argument, and what they're saying is we can and are doing, we're using GM crops to produce edible vaccines and pharmaceuticals, and that's often termed farming. But if we do that by engineering feed crops to do it, then there's a problem that those food and feed crops could get into the human food chain, and mistakes can and do happen, absolutely right. And therefore it would be much better to use other crops like tobacco or flax, and I do agree with that. Now, we're getting more into the meat of the sandwich now. Gene flow, the second of our 4 risks. Now, there are various ways in which we can get genes going from a GM crop to another plant. 2 of them are crop to crop. So we've got GM crop could cross-pollinate plants in a conventional crop. And that could lead to impurity in the food or the seed. Probability, well, it depends. I've put less than 2% there, but it depends. All I can say is that commercially we are used to separating crops so that we don't get, particularly seed crops, so that we don't get impurities, or if we do get them, we don't get them to more than about 2%. This is not an exact science because you've got the vagaries of nature out there. You've got insects that can transmit and do transmit pollen over large distances. No one is saying that there will never be contamination or impurities. There will be gene flow. But 2% per year? 2% per field, if you like. Harvest your field of a conventional crop, and 2% of it you might find had impurities that came, some of which might come from a neighbouring crop. Wouldn't always be, obviously, a GM crop because they might not be next door to one another. But so we are used to being able to deal with that in commercial farming, but it's not an exact science. And actually, if you look in the literature, there's not much in the literature, I suspect, because it's not a very sexy area to work in. But I do believe that we can get it right to an order of magnitude, let's say, as scientists. But the problem comes when you then start talking about organic crops. Now, the organic farmers wouldn't call it impurity, they call it contamination. There's a question here, because if something is safe to be grown, if it has been deemed safe for human consumption, should it really be called contamination? Well, they call it contamination because it contaminates what they regard as a pure crop, although I don't believe I know the definition of an organic crop. Organic farming is actually rather difficult to define. But anyway, because of the way they've defined their farming, they are demanding much lower degrees of contamination, which require much greater separation distances. So there's quite a debate about what these distances should be. And in fact, yesterday, and it's in this morning's Guardian, yesterday, DEFRA, that's our Ministry for the Environment and Farming in the UK, it launched a consultation about coexistence between GM conventional and organic farmers. So it's been in the news recently, but this is really just the start of the debate, and there's quite a lot of work going on in Europe about the levels of cross-contamination, particularly at long distances and for very low percentages. Then we've got a GM crop could cross to a wild relative, not the same species, but a closely related species. Let me emphasise, I forgot to emphasise it, I should have emphasised that our GM maize that we looked at earlier, that is not going to suddenly cross-pollinate with a tomato. We're not going to get all these unsightly or weird sort of new plants that are going to suddenly take over the earth. It's got to, it's a bit, well, it's a bit like biology. In biology, a species will only reproduce with its own species or with something that's pretty close to give a hybrid. But hybridization is possible. Each case is different, but that could lead, the hazard there could be ecosystem change of some form. What are volunteers? If a farmer grows GM oilseed rape, next year he's probably going to grow cereal. When he harvests that rape, he's harvesting the seed. A lot of seed will spill out of the tractor and will lay on the ground, and next year he'll get a lot of little oilseed rape plants coming up in his cereal. Now, instead of being a crop, all of a sudden they're a weed because he doesn't want them. So next crop he would have a GM weed in his crop. So that's again a problem. If that is allowed to grow, could cause impurity in food and seed. Oilseed rape's particularly vulnerable to that. And you can get wild populations of GM crops, and we'll see in a second an example of that. And again, that could lead to possible invasiveness. Some ethical questions. Can there be coexistence? Who's ethically and legally responsible? What is harm? Which groups are allowed to impose their own agendas on society? And in this, Donald Bruce, the scientist and clergyman, has written about this subject, and he has said, he has asked, how far society is obliged to bow to organic farmers who claim that GM would represent a commercial threat primarily because of the way they've chosen to define their own business, but equally, how far are the conventional farmers justified in saying it's our right to grow GM crops? Can either presume an exclusive claim? Let's have a look further at gene flow, because this is an important area. And to emphasise again, it doesn't always happen. So, for example, if you're growing GM beet, you will harvest the crop before it flowers, before it forms bolters, and so there won't be, or there shouldn't be, much or any gene flow. Maize has no wild relatives in the UK, and therefore we could grow GM maize without any problems of gene flow to wild relatives. But there are organic crops and there are other crops of maize, conventional crops, and similarly for oilseed rape. Here are some examples. You often see oilseed rape by the roadside. Doesn't last very long. That has been the subject of study by Professor Mick Crawley in a couple of Nature papers during the 1990s when scientists were looking at the possible persistence of GM rape long before it became controversial. But you often see it by roadsides because it quite simply spills out of lorries. The seed spills out and takes hold. Sometimes it will cross-pollinate, say, with wild radish, and here you've got a photo of there's feral rape there and there's wild radish here. The two of them could hybridize. Another example, here's rapeseed and here's Brassica napus. In the same genus you've got Brassica rapa, Bargeman's cabbage, grows by waterside, which is why it's called Bargeman's cabbage, and here it is on a river right next to an oilseed rape crop. So there is room there for cross-pollination and possible ecosystem change. And I'm going to digress now, and I'm going to say, actually, however much change that would cause, I don't believe it's going to cause anything like the amount of change that you get from invasive aliens, which are not GM. Here's Fallopian japonica, Japanese knotweed, and Mary can tell you about this, probably more than I can. They're not GM, they're just plants brought in from other countries, particularly by gardeners. So us middle-class people go to our garden centre. Yes, we're responsible for changing ecosystems, probably in quite a major way. Far more, I would suggest, than we're going to get through GM hybridisation, in some cases for the herbicide-tolerant crops anyway, and causes huge problems. So this is a very provocative slide. I do apologise in advance. Should we be as concerned, or I've just said that, what about campaigning organisers? Shouldn't they start picketing garden centres? And are these campaigns really motivated by what's publicly acceptable rather than morally respectable? And maybe Greenpeace ought to start campaigning against tobacco, which I think does much more harm than GMHT soya. But that was, I'm terribly sorry. The next maybe 3 or 4 slides I think are probably some of the most important, because they're an attempt to describe what happens and how we assess whether this is really a risky process or isn't a risky process. And it all has to do with natural selection, with selection pressure. So we take a GM crop plant, and there's wild plants in the countryside, in a population, and one of them actually is a weedy near relative. So they can hybridize, and there's the progeny. And that progeny may inherit the gene from the parent GM crop, which confers that GM trait. Now the question is, what will happen to the offspring of that progeny? At the moment its abundance is 1. Is it going to go up, establish and spread, or down to extinction? And the answer really has to do with whether it is whether that trait is conferring some advantage. So here, if we've got a cool place on land, these moose have wonderful fat bodies and good wide hooves so that they're able to step on the land and live in cool conditions. They're a lot better suited to it than giraffes would be, and so there's a selection against the giraffes and in favour of the moose. So this is really typical sort of Darwinian ideas of evolution, and which path follows depends on, as I say, whether it's going to confer an advantage. So if it's more fit, that new genotype, it's more fit, its inherited gene will be selected for. But if it's not, if there's no selective advantage, we can expect it to go to extinction. And this is a very good reference for that, Rosie Hales's paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. That was a fairly sort of theoretical approach, but also she's been involved in experiments too, and there are experiments going on. It's actually quite difficult to measure the reproductive rate of a plant. It takes a lot of effort. It's not something you can do in the lab. You're working outside. It takes a fair bit of money in terms of research grants to do it. But basically what we're doing is we're saying on farm we've got a GM crop, around it we've got the countryside. What's going to happen to that plant in the country? So we're not so much concerned about on farm because there the farmer is in control. It's what happens when it gets out of the bottle that we're concerned about. And so Rosie looked at these three traits and said, well, what is likely to be the case? Well, for GMHT, is there any advantage conferred on that progeny? Well, there isn't any herbicide that's sprayed in the countryside usually. So probably that will go to extinction. So she said relatively low risk, and experiments have confirmed that. What about if it was a BT, if it was insect resistant? Well, if that particular weed is controlled by moths or butterflies, and a few are, that conferred resistance to against being eaten by a moth would be a selective advantage. Otherwise it wouldn't be, and it all depends what species are present. For virus-resistant plants, many weeds, we believe, and this is an area actually in which I think not much is known, because we know a lot about how virus diseases affect crop plants, because we're interested in them, because they're crop plants, not so much about weeds. So an area in which little is known, but it's thought that many may be controlled by virus disease. Well, if we suddenly confer resistance to some virus, that may be a stronger selective advantage. And again, it depends what species are present. It's actually okay for papaya, which has no relatives in the wild and is not behaving like a weed. So Rosie said there was a gradation from HT to BT to VR in terms of how dangerous it would be if there was cross-pollination. So we can assess the risk in that way. Now let's move on a bit and try to answer Christine's question, which she asked to Dennis last night. Does GM usurp God's role as the creator of life? And the reason I want to focus on this is that I think biologists often, not me because I'm not a geneticist, but often biologists like Dennis have been working with these concepts all their career, and it's clear to them and obvious. They hardly have to think about it. I mean, we are just, we're collections of genes. Why are you so concerned about, this movement of genes around, and why is it an issue for you? But the general public really don't understand that, and I'd like to explore those sort of issues. That's a different issue, really, and I haven't got time for that. That's let's not worship nature, let's worship the creator sort of issue. But I'd like to explore this. I'm not sure. Intellectually, we may have taken on Darwinian thought. We may believe we have. The man in the street I'm talking about, not scientist now. And I class myself here as the man in the street because I'm not trained as a biologist. So have we really taken it on? And have we resolved any conflicts with theology? So the argument goes like, it's not my argument, it's Keith Davis who pointed this out in this Millennium essay in Nature. He said, well, Plato and Aristotle and the Greek thinkers imagined species as sort of unchangeable forms, unchangeable types. Very definite, very fixed. Whereas Darwin stressed the uniqueness of an individual. And for Darwin, the species is a statistical abstraction. So I've tried to illustrate this here in this graph. I've actually graphed colour versus shape. And I'm really asking, are these represent different individuals which might or might not? They are different individuals, they may or may not be different species. They appear to differ in colour and shape, and we've got more vertical on that side and we've got more horizontal this side. We've got more blue down here and we've got more green up here. So it's an abstract representation. They may look different, but when we compare them with other individuals, we can actually, well, actually they're quite similar. There are more within the within group differences are much smaller than the between group differences, and we suddenly see them in a different light, and we can see what Darwin means by a statistical abstraction. This, where I've put the ellipse, is a statistical abstraction showing that they are a species. Well, how does that relate to actual biology? Well, you can say, well, actually, we know what a species is, don't we? A species is something that where individuals within the species reproduce and individuals outside the species don't reproduce. Well, yes, but most biologists would have great difficulty sorting out what is a species, what is it a species or is it just a race? I mean, gardeners, we know this. We're used to having varieties of the same species. Those varieties don't always hybridize with one another. And we've been pushing at the boundaries as, well, let's say as plant breeders. First of all, as people who weren't called scientists, and then later on as scientists. But we've been pushing at the boundaries. First recorded plant hybrid, 1700s. Been pushing at the boundaries for years. And as you read this, and I'm sorry for all the jargon, but here in the late 19th century, we've got crossing across two species. Triticale, this is our normal variety now. It's a wheat by rye cross, grown on 2 million hectares. So we've been doing this for a long time. Not easy for us to say exactly what a species is. It's a bit plastic. And as we see more evidence, so John this morning was talking about how many genes have we got in common. How many genes are there? First of all, 25,000 for the human. Here I am with my dear daughter Sophie, and we've got quite a lot of genes in common. But I've probably got about 50% of genes in common with a banana. Now, and we as the man in the street, I think now is used to the idea that that we come from that there is evolution, that speciation does not stay static, but species evolve and change, and we have common ancestors. I might have to go back a long way to get the common ancestor with a fungus that John was so concerned about this morning, but if I go back far enough, I'll find them. So we've got genes in common, and it's Keith Davis's idea that we haven't actually taken this on board, that the man in the street is actually still thinking of species as fixed, unchanging. So, yes, we've read about evolution, and we've read good textbooks about it for the general public. Maybe we haven't actually taken it on board yet. And if you do take it on board, I would suggest there is less reason to think that we're going against the Creator than if we retain this Platonic view. And I think that Platonic view of species explains the yuck factor that many people have over GM, and also explains this curious sort of gap between the biologists who don't appear at all concerned and the person in the street who is concerned. Right. Let's move quickly on. This is a photo about the indirect effects, the third risk of the 4 risks of GM crops. And it's a photo taken from my study window, and we're very fortunate. We now live in the wonderful county of Norfolk. And this is taken, and we're surrounded by farmland. This is a not very good photo, because I haven't got a very good camera, of a goldfinch perched at the top of a tree. And it's wildlife, and it's wildlife that we love to see, marvel at, and have awe of, and conserve. That's why 1 million of us, or you, are members of the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. Huge political impact. And we live, as Rosie Hales said, now this is in contrast to you in the USA. You have your wonderful wildernesses, Yellowstone Park, etc. And then you have your acres and acres and acres, millions of hectares of prairie land. So you've separated off what you regard as your wilderness from, or your national parks, from your agricultural area. And if you talk to agricultural biotechnologists, particularly from Monsanto and companies like that, they can't see what the problem is in Europe. And one of the reasons is that they don't understand that, as Rosie Hales puts it, we in the UK effectively live inside our national parks and are very concerned. Not only do we have, farmers living in our country, are extremely articulate people like solicitors and MPs and judges and chief constables, and they like their wildlife, and they're very good at writing to the newspaper when anything threatens it. Good for them. So, the indirect effects, there is a context to them. And the context is that, yes, we've been increasing yield, and herbicide-tolerant systems would help to do that. Increasing yield since the Second World War, when food was scarce, but at the expense of our arable farmland wildlife. Weeds, certainly. And weeds are food for invertebrate and for seed-eating birds, and are also habitat for birds and invertebrates. Lots of references in the literature to show this is not just an idle correlation, one has actually caused the other. And Chris Pollock, who's the chairman of ACRE, the Advisory Committee on Releases to the Environment, put it very well. I think, and he said, you get a certain amount of energy from the sun, you can put it in a balance, and it's up to us what we do with it. Either we can have a crop, lots of yield, or we can have lots of wildlife. We can't actually have both. There is a limit to how much of both we can have. So, extra ethical questions here. We are meant to act as good stewards. We're meant to tend and care for the garden. I'm sure Sir Gillian Prance will say more of that this evening. Other questions are more difficult. Well, wouldn't it be better if we farmed non-intensively, organically? Well, is there enough extra land that because organic farming you don't get the same yields? And what will be the environmental effect of ploughing up that marginal land? Other questions. What do we actually want from our countryside? We're going through this debate now, and in fact, very good Christian Sir Don Curry wrote the Curry Report, The Future of Food and Farming, in which we're having this debate. We've probably finished this debate now in the UK, and we're moving over, with the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, we're moving over from subsidising production to subsidising environmentally sensitive ways of farming. So we are beginning to make these decisions. What wildlife do we conserve? And here's a very provocative question. Is slug biodiversity as important as skylarks? Why not? Very briefly, I'll try and run through the socio-economic effects. This on the right is golden rice, and it really is coloured golden. It's had the vitamin A, a gene for expressing vitamin A engineered into it. But the Swiss academic who developed it, and God bless him, pushed and pushed and pushed for it, required permissions from 32 companies to use 70 processes covered by intellectual property rights. So it wasn't easy, but it has these advantages which those who are against GM crops find it, I think, quite difficult to argue against, because they use a lot of these arguments against other crops. And it couldn't have been developed by traditional methods. It's often not appreciated that most of the early advances in GM, of course it goes right the way back to this city and this university, Francis Crick and Watson. Most of those early advances were made at universities and publicly funded research institutes, and even now, especially in the developing world, not all of the research is done by industry. A lot done here. This is the International Rice Research Institute. So it brings us to questions like that question that you had over lunch. Who do you trust for information? Doesn't everybody actually have an interest? Who is really independent in this area? Can I have an agenda and still be impartial? Can I be paid and still be impartial? I think the answer to that is probably not, actually. Now, also, other difficult questions. Is there something special about food that we should emphasize ethical rules more for seed companies? I mean, we pray, give us this day our daily bread. Does that make it special? Or is it unfair for them to be singled out because they're just trying to make a profit the same way as manufacturers of mobile phones would try to make a profit? Maybe we should be concerned that so much power is concentrated into very few companies. That may be an inevitable consequence of the fact that if you want regulation, it takes a long time to get these GM crops through the regulatory process. If you want risk assessment, that costs money, and that means you're forcing up your development costs. And the same is true of pharmaceuticals, where a lot of the pharmaceutical companies have merged to form these giant companies. And it brings us back to the question, is IPR ethical or fair? Lots to debate there. It's not all bad news, because in the third world we have organisations like the AATF. Their mission is to use biotechnology, but to work with local farmers, local solutions, using local investment. They're Rockefeller Foundation funded, so they're charitable. And I think they're doing quite a lot of good work and now being recognised by countries such as Kenya. Gordon Conway had a lot to do with them. Questions over the green revolution. We're in a new revolution, the bio-revolution. And previously we used conventional breeding techniques for the green revolution. Now we require a much higher degree of skills. Fortunately, places like India and China, those skills are now coming through, and many scientists there. And we had low capital costs before, but as I've just said, rather high capital costs now. Even the green revolution itself is still, I think, controversial. The Christian Aid attitude towards it seems to be much more towards this first one, that millions were forced to migrate and no longer allowed to be subsistence farmers, and they had to go to overcrowded cities. On the other hand, proponents of the green revolution argue quite reasonably it saved millions from hunger, and it gave them the choice to go from the countryside to the cities. I'm not an expert in this area, but it is still controversial. And finally, terminator technology. This is when a company, as well as putting a particular trait into a crop, puts another gene in which stops the plant from reproducing, in the sense that its seed is sterile and it will not reproduce. And the Secretary General of the World Council of Churches is very much against this. I should say that actually the companies have a voluntary moratorium against. They signed an agreement saying we are not going to employ terminator technology, I think in the late 1990s, and they have not actually changed that position, but it has been in the news recently because of rumours that they might be. And if they were able to, this lady would not be able to save seed from maize. Couple of issues that you might want to consider. First of all, when we go to the garden centre, we're used to buying F1 hybrids, and quite often we will be buying seed that won't reproduce. It will produce one crop, but if we save the seed from that crop, it won't do very well the next generation. And the other thing that might be an advantage for terminator technology is we could guarantee, if we did have it, there would be no gene flow. So if you're concerned about gene flow, you could stop it with terminator technology. Questions here would be, well, why shouldn't we give them the choice whether to buy conventional seed or terminator technology? Why completely ban it? Can't the markets decide? On the other hand, might it be that companies might try to lock in farmers to a dependence that they might find it difficult to escape from? It's certainly true that in terms of approved varieties, there are many fewer approved within the EU for growing than there used to be. Is that a good thing? Certainly there's been a great reduction in genetic diversity. You could almost ask whether it was ethical. And might GM and terminated technology exacerbate that? And finally, some other questions that I just threw in because they didn't appear elsewhere in the talk. If you haven't got enough questions so far. Is natural necessarily good? I've heard a lot about reductionism. I still prefer it to holistic thought and would argue that often reductionists take due account of complexity and of hierarchical systems and of richness. For example, Anderson and May's mathematical models of infectious diseases are reductionist. And is organic farming ethically a good thing? Contrast that with the what we were told after the fall, by the sweat of your brow you will eat your food. And finally, we're all searching for a simpler lifestyle. I just want to read you, it's a poem from East Anglia, so since my wife's family come from there, and my wife's uncle often recites it. And it's the poem of a ploughman, an old ploughman. They used to have the back doors in the farmhouses where the farm workers would go because they weren't allowed in the front door. So they had to go in the back door, and they were called Bacchus boys. And this chap, he's been working in the countryside for years and years. And now I've ruled my innards out, and I can't do nothing more. So I sits and I thinks of the old times, for there ain't nothing like what they were when I were a Bacchus boy. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I'm sure Joe will be delighted to answer questions, won't you? Any questions?
I'll start off with if I may, with a fairly topical question, I guess. We as consumers meet the whole business market. Supermarkets, I suppose it's all around the world, but certainly in the United Kingdom have got more and more dominant, and fewer and fewer, and bigger and more dominant, and all the rest of it. Do you think that those pressures are now got too great, and that we should look to see a breakup of this kind of way of proceeding to get a more diverse means of food delivery to the purchaser, and maybe this would help to alter the the kind of power structure systems that are going on in the food industry?
I think that's a difficult question, because it's moving into the kind of economic market questions that I don't really feel capable of answering. But I can say that in the late 1997, there were GM products on sale in supermarkets. They were doing quite well. There was a Flavour Savour tomato. And if you actually eat cheese, you're probably eating, if not GM material, but certainly the rennet is produced with a GM technology. No longer do we use animal extracted enzymes for producing rennet, which helps in cheese making. So there are, there were, and there are GM processes which are being used. The supermarkets would say that they were merely reacting to consumer pressure. Consumer pressure can and was greatly influenced in the late 1990s by campaigns in the Daily Mail and in the Guardian and in the tabloids, which were pretty hysterical. I think the only thing I can say is that I really do believe that when this all comes around again, as I'm sure it will, around 2009, 2010 probably, I think that the debate, while it didn't appear to move on in the 3 years while we were doing the trials, I think the debate has moved on, and I think I detect that people are a little bit more open-minded, and they're less liable, I think, next time to be swayed by hysteria. That's my hope.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. You have raised a number of questions on scientific, social, religious, ethical issues related to the GM crops. I come from rural South India, and it's very difficult for me not to be emotionally charged with the issue, because right now there are number of farmers who have committed suicide. Last year it also happened that way. Now I have just, to be very precise, let's imagine a situation where there is no involvement of market interest in pushing the agenda. Okay? And multinationals, you know, they are not Christians and the followers of Dalai Lama. They have their own interest. Green revolution, you cannot separate it from Bhopal tragedy, in a way, pesticides, etc. And in India, I come from India, I am telling you, multinational companies don't put forward this evidence in any public debate. They just buy the politicians and get the things done. It's very easy for now for any British person to go to South India and get the kidney transplant illegally just by paying a few £100, and everything will be all right. That's the reality we are talking about. Now, do you think that apart from market interest and profit, is there any philanthropic reason whatsoever in the scientific community as a whole to go for GM crops and not to take the dig at environmental groups like Peace, what is that? Greenpeace. I tend to side with Greenpeace or environmentalists not because they are telling the truth all the time, but they raise certain questions which have elements of truth which are marginalized. So if we remove the commercial interests, profit, do you believe multinationals are doing it because they are very nice with, people, poor people in the third world?
No, I don't believe they're doing it because they're very nice. I believe they're doing it because they want to make a profit. But I also believe that there are many publicly funded scientists in India and in China and in other countries who, the Philippines, for example, with the golden rice issue. So that's UN funded. It's part of the CGIAR group of research institutes which circle the world. And so, yes, I believe that there are scientists there who are developing crops for less profit motivated reasons. And I certainly share your skepticism. I tried to allude to it that the original GM crops in this country, the herbicide tolerant ones, the consumers said, well, what is in it for us? Very little. I mean, all the consumers could see was that the companies were going to make a profit from the farmers, and the farmers were going to make a profit. So, yes, I would. I can see that point that you're making, and I would also say that I think it behoves us, and I understand the difficulties in India of the ease with which you can overcome any regulation. Yes, and I appreciate that, and I think it means that we have a greater responsibility in our countries to take risk assessment seriously, and to really, if there is anything dangerous, to stop it before it gets a hold elsewhere.
But there is a problem. The phase 3 clinical trials, which cannot take place in the US right now, are now coming back to India,
Yeah.
and Indian governments are subsidizing, on the in the income tax. And I feel bad to say that, there are reports that where the banned drugs, which are really, really banned in the West, are being given to the patients, and the patients are getting money, so they say, fine.
Yeah.
And they are illiterate, and you can get anything signed as informed consent.
Yeah.
My question is, I believe you are conscientious and a man of faith, and and I believe you will not be doing unethical, but I can't say that for the whole science community, because majority of the science technology community are engaged in the business of killing man. I mean, the defense research, for example.
Well,
Okay, in India particularly, I could say that.
all right. Well, let me ask you how you would react to the BT cotton story, where and cotton is grown in India, and there is a lot of BT cotton in India. Now that is reducing insecticidal usage. Now, I think that demonstrates that that not all technology is. Your last sentence, I probably misunderstood you, but it sounded as if you were saying that technology almost has, by definition, to be harmful. I think that's a good example of a technology which is actually benefiting through reducing the amount of insecticide that would be poured onto fields by Indian farmers.
Indian government and the politicians, I am being self-critical, I don't believe they have great interest in the lot of farmers or the poor people as a whole at all. Otherwise they will not be doing that kind of thing which they are doing now. And the way the Bhopal gas tragedy happened, the way so many things happened, there are series of things which it's very easy to buy the science community in many developing countries. I could tell you series of vaccine trials done by Indian Council of Medical Research. My professor was engaged and he was sacked. He was gagged actually, And medical community and scientific community is kind of not two different worlds. The way things happen day after day, I am in that world. I am not outside that world. So I am kind of skeptical in the sense that when the way things happen in the West do not happen in other parts of the world. And I believe there are people who are conscientious, but I cannot expect that from all.
I think I would be very worried if a large company like Monsanto developed, or I'd be more worried if a large company like Monsanto developed a GM crop that was specifically going to be used in India, rather than them developing a GM crop which is going to be used first of all in North America, and then, if it's successful, exported to India, because although I don't believe that the US risk assessment, I'm not saying the US risk assessment process is wonderful or even necessarily as good as our own, at least those particular crops that are now sold commercially have been through the US own risk assessment procedures, and they are effectively promoting crops in India which they are prepared and are using within their own country. Whether those crops have been assessed properly, as I say, is another separate question that we ought to address.
You know what they did with basmati, for example. You know the basmati, they patented it as basmati. Okay, and we have to go to WTO to settle the case.
Yeah. I certainly agree that that there is a lot that needs to be done to ensure greater equity in as regards to WTO rules, and I would go along with you completely there. Yeah.
Can I? I'll take the privilege of having the microphone to ask you a question. You showed us two pictures of maize, one GM modified, one not, and you said, "Can you tell the difference?" Well, of course, you couldn't tell the difference from the photographs. So my question is, if you looked at the genome of those two, and you didn't have a prior reference to know which one was genetically modified and which one wasn't, would you be able to tell which one had been tinkered with by man?
Right. Well, the easiest way of telling would be to grow them and apply glyphosate, and effectively you're looking then at the phenotype and seeing which one of them resisted and did not die and which one of them died. Now, that's not an answer to your question.
That wasn't the question.
No, I know. I'm getting to that. and it surprises me that methods to quickly test whether or not which one of those two was GM and which one wasn't weren't available up until relatively recently, but they are being developed at Institute of Grassland Environmental Research Aberystwyth, developing sort of rapid throughput methods. I mean, you could do it slowly. Yes, you could tell from genetic analysis which one, but you'd have to do it slowly. And now they've got methods that are much more rapid.
So it was more the philosophical question.
Yeah.
Could you tell whether one had arisen naturally or one had arisen by the intervention of humans?
Well, you'd be able to tell because one would have the new gene in it.
But how do you know that wasn't the original one and it had lost that gene?
Because it would not have, because the gene for herbicide tolerance is from a soil bacteria, and it would not have acquired that naturally. It would only have acquired it through genetic manipulation.
Not quite satisfied yet.
No. You can tell I'm going outside my field, which is not molecular biology. Here's an expert.
Yeah, indeed not. I mean, the soil bacterium has got a variety of the same enzyme that the plant itself has got, and so what you'll have in there is one. You'll have the plant version, which is susceptible to the herbicide, and you'll have the bacterial version, which isn't. And in my view, that given long enough of high pressure selection, or naturally spontaneously in the field, the plant version will one day mutate to be resistant like the bacterial one already is. So philosophically, you could have got there by natural selection.
Sorry, I understand exactly what you mean. There are actually naturally occurring herbicide-tolerant varieties of rape. So in that case, yes, in the case of rape, I'm not aware that there are any naturally occurring herbicide-tolerant varieties of maize, but rape there are. Yeah.
You see, the philosophical question then is that it diffuses the novelty of GM foods, doesn't it? Because it means if this could have arisen naturally, then we've just sped up a process that might have happened anyway. We haven't made a Frankenstein in that sense.
I've argued that elsewhere.
Okay.
Good. Interestingly, if you take GM sugar beet and you make it into sugar, there's no trace of the GM plant left in the sugar. No protein, and no way of testing whether it would. It hasn't got any DNA in it, so it hasn't got any no way of testing whether it was from a GM plant or from a non-GM plant. Although, of course, British Sugar are still very concerned and would not allow GM sugar into their factories.
I had a quick question about the public response to GM foods. I sense a little bit of a contradiction, because if you look at the general attitude of people towards food, I think there's a percentage of people that are very concerned about the food. They're into health foods, etc., and they're very careful what they buy at supermarkets and so on. But I think the great majority of people in our society, they don't give anything about what they eat. They eat whatever they can get their hands on, I think. And so I sense a little bit of a contradiction between the aversion against GM foods and and on the other hand, the lack of interest in health foods in the majority of people.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm most concerned by the gene flow side of it. When you have left the plant into the countryside, it's a point of no return. And if it's a wind pollinator like corn, the pollen might flow for miles and miles and miles. And if it's an insect pollinator, it is more restricted. But anyhow, these genes will in turn go into other organisms, whether bacteria or plants. And what will happen to the ecosystem? We say we are in the very beginning of GM plants. If you go 10 years further or 20 years further, like we have the Iberian slug spreading in southern Norway, it's impossible to stop it. And we have a virus on apples and prunes, and it's impossible to stop it. They have used millions and millions to take it on. What will happen to the ecosystem?
Right. I think you made a number of statements that I wouldn't necessarily agree with in your question. I'm not sure I can remember them all. One was, once it's out there, it's going to be out there forever. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, again, I think it depends on the selection pressure, and that's the key argument that the committees consider. The fact that there is going to be gene flow has never been denied. It's always been accepted that there would be gene flow. And the question is, what then? So what? It's not always the case that a gene once out there will be out there forever. It could be. It depends upon whether its niche that it's in is favourable or not. The business about exchanging genes with bacteria, the evidence for horizontal gene flow, that is gene flow that doesn't come about through reproduction, is very sketchy. And yes, I think people believe that it happens, but because they can look at the genome and see that it has happened in the past. But generally, people think that the frequency is one or two events in evolutionary time. So they assess the risk on that basis, and again ask the question: well, if it did happen, what would be the worst case scenario? Yes, some species do get into ecosystems, and particularly if they've not been there before and have no natural enemies. And you mention a virus in Scandinavia, possums in New Zealand, rats which come on board ships onto islands can destroy native bird populations. Usually it's when something's been introduced from elsewhere and there's an ecological reason why it does well and it doesn't have any natural enemies. And those are the sort of issues that are assessed by ecologists, by ecological geneticists. I don't think one can say there is definitely going to be a problem here, because that's exactly the areas that they look at carefully.
Okay, thank you. One more question, then we'll stop.
I'm a little bit puzzled. I have the impression, maybe it is wrong, this impression, that people who are actively dealing with genetic manipulation in animals or humans or in plants are for genetic manipulations, and others are quite reluctant, people who are outside that field. I will be nasty. Isn't it that the people who have gone over to practice genetic manipulations have accepted to go above a threshold, maybe above a taboo, and then it is easier to go over other taboos, and where does it lead? Well, that is a first nasty question. Then another one. In the 60s, there was a green revolution led, I think, mostly by French people. And I remember in the Andes in South America, they brought new species. I don't remember if it was maize or wheat, which were more resistant to drought, I think, and bringing more, being more effective in, well, for one seed you had a bigger crop. And so in whole regions of the Andes, the natives ate their own seeds and planted these new seeds, thinking paradise is for tomorrow. But a few years later, there was a sickness, and all the crops had been destroyed, and they were crying because their own species were destroyed, and they had nothing more. They had eaten them, and they were local species which were very resistant. Mm-hmm. So aren't we in front of such problems?
Right. Two separate questions. In answer to the first one, well, I'll try and answer both of them. In answer to the first one, yes, I think there is a real problem about, you know, who you can trust and how you can be impartial. I will give you two examples. When I started in GM work, I'd never worked in GM before 1998, and I have never done any genetic manipulation because they wouldn't let me in a lab. I wouldn't know what to do if I got in there. So, I mean, I'm an ecologist, so I know a little about big things, and I don't know anything about the little things. So I had a completely open mind. If anything, I was vaguely against it. And it's been over the last 9 years that I've looked at the issues for and against. I've heard NGOs. I've been attacked by NGOs. I've heard industry. And I've come to my own opinion. I think if you're immersed in an area for that length of time, you do form an opinion. You may say, I am no longer independent because I now have an opinion, and you might be right. But I think I've tried to present both sides in my argument, and what I would say is go and have a look at more of the literature. Go and have a look at the pro and the anti-arguments. Don't, you know, just take my word for it. And I've given quite a lot of references to let you do that. The other thing I would say is that when we did the farm scale evaluations, we were a bunch of ecologists. We weren't a bunch of molecular biologists. We had molecular biologists in our institute, and our director is very pro-biotechnology. But we were assessing the risk to wildlife, and we were completely neutral. I mean, we were not either funded by or had no brief for those other departments. And actually there was quite a lot of conflict in the sense that we didn't, the thing was so controversial, we didn't let our director know what the results were, and I didn't want to let him know before the press release, but actually we gave him the night before to look at the papers. They were completely confidential until then, so we were not swayed one way or the other. But I must admit, you know, even within that team, there were people who were more anti, And there were people who had received a small amount of money from industry, and they were more pro. And it came out not so much in the data, because the data cannot lie, but certainly the interpretation that these different groups put on the data was different. We were very fortunate. We had a large group, and we arrived at a consensus without any exterior pressure. And the whole thing was indeed so controversial that the government were desperate to try and make sure it was high quality science. So we were left as scientists, and we had a scientific steering committee above us of experts who were our peers to scrutinise what we were doing. So risk assessment, I think, can be done fairly, but I do accept the difficulties. And there's no doubt, you talk to people like Derek Burke, who's great Christian, has written extensively on this subject. There's no doubt, he comes from a plant biotechnological background. He's slightly more pro than maybe other people would with the same data. So I don't disagree. I think we can overcome that problem, but I don't disagree. And your next question really, I think, related to what I was saying in one of my slides, was that we must try to maintain genetic diversity and maintain a wide range of genes available, and not overreach ourselves and believe that we know everything and restrict our ability to recover from mistakes that we might make. So I think that's a good point.